All right, folks, David Parsons here. Welcome to Nostalgia Trap. Before we even get started this week, I want to let you know of a special deal we've got going on the Nostalgia Trap Patreon page for you super fans, or for anyone who just wants to support the show a little more and get something back for it. I'm sending, it's a small gesture, but I'm sending t-shirts to anybody who joins the Culture Warrior tier between now and December 6th, 2022. And that's as a thank you and for watching and checking out Trap TV. These are episodes that are visual essays featuring my ideas, thoughts, etc. on American history and culture. I'm posting those for our Culture Warriors. So those are the sorts of things you can check out on the Patreon page. I appreciate it. Just posted the first Trap TV episode. There are many more to come. Our first series is called Brick and Mortar, entirely about the history of architecture and the built environment in America. Lots of talk about Disneyland and Walter Benjamin and carousels, amusement parks. Really, really fun stuff, and we got a lot more to come. So if you want to check all that out, patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. I really appreciate it. And the links for all that stuff are in the episode description. Okay, I'm very excited to share this conversation today with Chad Pearson. He is a professor of history at the University of North Texas, has an awesome new book out right now from the University of North Carolina Press called Capitol's Terrorists, Klansmen, Lawmen, and Employers in the Late 19th Century. We're talking about capitalism and violence, and I think that's enough to get us started. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Thanks for listening to Nostalgia Trap. Here is me with Chad Pearson. All right, Chad Pearson, great to see you. How are you?
I'm great. Really happy to be here.
I am very excited to speak with you. Your book caught my attention on the University of North Carolina Press website. When I saw the title, I felt like it was speaking to Nostalgia Trap, everything we've talked about for years on here. So thank you for joining me. I'm really excited to talk with you.
Thank you so much.
Your book, by the way, is called Capitol's Terrorists, Klansmen, Lawmen, and Employers in the Long 19th Century. And maybe just to get us started, I can speak a little bit of why this book excites me. It takes on a significant piece, I would say, of the moral architecture in the story of American history. That's still a bit of mythology, or a big bit of mythology, in terms of the Civil War and why the Civil War was fought, and the idea that that slavery was wrong morally because for a number of reasons, but one of the main ones was because they used violence to coerce and discipline a labor force, and that after the Civil War, it gave way to a free labor ideology in which people could enter into wages and contracts, and that system was better morally because it didn't have the violence that slavery had. Your book tells a different story and complicates that a bit, I would say. What got you started thinking about the sort of like violence that carries on in the years after the Civil War? Because it seems so keyed in to creating the system that is still alive today.
Right. No, absolutely. So I generally want to make sense of the lives of those at the top of society and how those people have made the lives of ordinary people miserable. And so they do this in a number of different ways. And so I start with the Civil War, that era, and I very much follow W.E.B. Du Bois's argument that the Civil War constituted, or at least for the enslaved people, it was a general strike. So to look at the Civil War as a labor conflict, not just a military one. And so in the context of that general strike of 3 to 4 million enslaved people, you have the plantation ruling class who were uninterested in giving up their rights. And so they saw these former enslaved people and demanded that they continue to labor. And one way they did that, one way they enforced their will, is by forming vigilante organizations, the most famous of which is the Ku Klux Klan. And so my first chapter is about the Klan and the way it organized its sociological composition, and I look at different forms of violence. So obviously the Klan and planters were highly coercive to the labor force, but they weren't the only ones. If we look in subsequent decades and we go north to the Midwest, we see employers responding to their own sets of labor problems and demanding that workers, get back to work, don't strike, don't join unions. And we see this into the 20th century and beyond. But I really stop around the era of World War I. So I seek to show the continuity of managerial thuggery, the
Right,
continuity of
right.
managerial thuggery in different contexts and across racial lines.
So the one that I think is maybe most familiar to people, and it's in part I think what makes your story so important and relevant is that first chapter of yours about Reconstruction and about the era in which there's sort of like this. I'm trying to think of the is it Douglas Blackmun, the slavery by another
Slave by another
name.
name. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
it seems like it's treading in those waters. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how we convert a slave system to an industrial system? Because it seems like there's that's kind of a key story to understand like how the vigilante violence and the discipline and coercion of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan translates into union organizing and the world of labor and
Right.
industrial capitalism in the North and other areas beyond the South. I guess part of it is like kind of like understanding how things in the South become sort of spread ideas to other areas. Yeah.
Right. So rather look at the South as sort of this backwater. I look at the South, particularly in this period after the Civil War, as a place where a lot of these repressive managerial techniques kind of emerge. So of course, the Civil War was this enormously important emancipatory event, and then the Reconstruction period. You have 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. You have African Americans elected to positions of power, but you also have this backlash. And so I look at the Klan as one of the chief players here. And rather than describe the Klan as just this, hateful white supremacist organization, of course it was, but I try to understand what were the interests of the Klansmen in leadership positions. What sort of society did they want to live in? And they basically wanted to live in a society in which the black masses, kept their mouths shut and worked. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so that cuts against what these former slaves wanted to do. They wanted to get educated. They wanted to pray. They wanted to join with one another. They wanted to leave the monotony of the plantations and go to the cities where they received help from freedmen's bureaus, where they went to schools. And so the Klan was really the armed wing of the planter society, and it sought to do everything in its power to, in the words of its leader, Nathan Bedford Forrest, keep the N-word in his place. Keep the
Mm-hmm.
N-word in his place. And so they engaged in a number of brutal tactics in order to do that. They would kidnap Klansmen from certain areas, bring them back to fields and kitchens. They would drive out outside so-called carpetbaggers. These were mostly white Republicans from the North who would come down and teach, and those people had no place in the South. They had no place in the view of these Klansmen in those communities. So it's about managing both internal and external challenges, and they did that violently.
How does that intersect with sort of the industrialization that's happening in the South? Because the way I'm sort of I part of me wants to understand this as well. This is like a transitioning kind of capitalism that's happening, and it seems like what are the industries that are happening in the South, and how are they intersecting with like the Ku Klux Klan?
Sure. So difficult to say with it's hard to generalize, I should say, but
Mm,
basically you have the folks that I explore mostly rural-based plantation owners. At the same time, many of these folks later on will be the New South boosters and will seek heavy industry. So I trace the lives of a number of folks, a handful of whom were wealthy. They come from wealthy slave families. Then they were active in the Klan, and then at the turn of the century, as they're older, they're involved in groups like the Southern Industrial Association, which was business group that sought to lure northern capital to the South by promising low wages and few labor strikes, and very little in the way of labor instability. So the fundamental desire to maintain a quiescent workforce is consistent across industries and across time.
And I guess my question in this period, and I think it's one that's probably going to be my question for a lot of these periods and the different moments of violence, disciplining labor forces, is sort of like, who is doing the actual thuggery in terms of the actual blood work of it? Because I don't imagine that industrialists, bankers are going down to these places themselves and actually handling the violence directly. So how do they coerce? Doesn't it take a certain coercion of a population? Whoever's doing the actual violence, who are the thugs, I guess, is the question.
Right. Well, I actually do think that these sort of privileged, well-off folks did get their hands dirty by engaging in direct union fighting. So I talk, the Klan, I think it's fair to say, obviously very secretive, but the leadership of the Klan were these more privileged folks. To what extent they got their hands dirty? Well, I mean, there are cases. I give the case of a guy named John Honeycutt, who's just a relatively young guy. He has this labor problem. He can't get any workers to pick his cotton. And I don't know if you remember the story in the book, but he basically goes to, he eavesdrops on these African Americans who are involved in boycotting him. They didn't want to work for him, and so he sneaks up on them, and then he approaches them with a gun in his hand, and he says, "You folks, you got to come work for me." Then he goes back and he gets his Ku Klux Klan buddies. They ride around what he called Negro Town, and the next day, the elders from an African American community said, "Hey, look, we want you to stop bothering us. What will it take for you to stop bothering us?" And he says, "Get these guys to work for me." And he says, the next day I got up there, more than a dozen of them, and we made peace.
Wow. Yeah.
There'd be no reason to assault these people, right? The Klan was not interested in outright killing people for the sake of killing people, right? Or beating people for the sake of beating. They had a goal, and that goal was to, or at least one of their goals, right, was to control communities and labor.
Can we talk a little bit about how that, because I mean, I think part of a history that more and more people want to talk about now because of the sort of attention on police and race in America, and the history of the South and what that has to do with the history of law enforcement. But where is law enforcement, the development of law enforcement with this? Because it seems like it's a critical part of your story, is sort of how I guess in the long view, sort of how a lot of this vigilante violence becomes institutional.
That's right. And so I talk primarily about what I call private sector terrorists. These are the landowners, the employers, the bankers, etc. But they had plenty of help from those in the public sector. There are obviously exceptions, especially with respect to the Klan, where the federal government sought to clamp down in the wake of the Enforcement Acts in the early 1870s. But that clampdown was, historians debate this, but the leaders of the Klan, most of them evaded serious punishment. I read somewhere recently that it was only something like 65 Klansmen served time during this period. And so, yes, there were trials, there were prosecutions, there were convictions, but we're not talking huge numbers, especially when we consider the size of the Klan itself, which is really hard to get a handle on given its secrecy. But anecdotally, folks who were in it would talk about, pretty much every Confederate veteran was a Klansman, right? And so, again, it was a hyper secretive organization. Hard to drill down, but on your larger question, the role of armed forces, certainly public sector armed forces, certainly we see their interventions in a number of labor confrontations, particularly in the North during the Gilded Age, when you have these strikes break out. I don't think any honest any sober-minded person would ever say that the police served as a neutral force in the context of labor unrest. I mean, they help management. So then the question becomes: so then why did some of these privileged businessmen get their hands dirty? In other words, if the police were there, or they could hire, say, the Pinkertons or other private security agencies, why did they take up weapons and fight strikers, kidnap strikers, punish disobedient workers more broadly? And I think perhaps the most obvious reason is because it was the most efficient way to deal with the problem. It's easier to just take care of the issue than to try to get a judge to issue an injunction, or get a political leader to declare martial law. I mean they did that as well, but these folks would just go out, and there's very little accountability. Right? There's very little accountability for their involvement in direct thuggery.
What about as this story progresses out of Reconstruction? How does it turn into or evolve into a kind of law and order language? Because part of your story is you kind of create a number of, or I guess discuss a number of archetypal characters: the terrorists, the enablers, and the sort of myth makers, or the narrative, the storytellers.
Right.
So maybe we can talk a little bit about each of those categories as we move forward, because one of the I don't know where you would place this figure, but J. West Goodwin is a figure you discussed quite a bit in both your introduction and in the book itself. Can you talk a little bit about him, because he seems like a kind of like critical figure in understanding how these things transition from vigilante violence to sort of like state violence, if that makes sense. Right.
No, he's such a key figure. First, on the larger point about the different categories that I outlined. So I refer to violent employers as terrorists. And when I talk about employers, I talk broadly, and I include groups like the Ku Klux Klan in that, but also organizations like the Law and Order Leagues and the Citizens Alliances. So that's the chief subject of my book. But then the question becomes, well, how are they able to go around and engage in such acts of thuggery? And the reason is because they have enablers, right? Judges, politicians, cops, National Guardsmen, sometimes federal troops, right? These folks, in the context of labor management conflicts, sided with the bosses. There might be exceptions here and there. Maybe, some sheriff who, workers elected, would be reluctant to clamp down. Sure, that happened. But in general, when you have these sharp confrontations, you have the state backed the ruling class. And then how do you gain legitimacy? You can't just allow this naked repression to exist. You have to kind of give legitimacy to it. And so the third group I discuss are what I call the narrative creators. These were those who own newspapers. I also talk about novelists. I mention clergymen. These are the folks who were in positions of power to narrate the stories, and they narrated these stories in ways that served the interests of the practitioners of this thuggery, that is, the employers and the ruling class more broadly. And so a key figure in all of this, I like to write about individuals. I think that it really illustrates nicely what's going on here. And one figure who is really important in my book, his name is J. West Goodwin, as you noted. And J. West Goodwin was important because he was one of the leaders and the organizers of the Law and Order League movement in Sedalia, Missouri. A lot of people don't know where Sedalia is. It's about an hour east of Kansas City. About 20,000 people today. It's a home of Jay Gould's railroad shops, so a big union presence there, railroad workers. And so J. West Goodwin was a newspaper owner. He owned and edited the Sedalia Bazoo, which was a big paper in Missouri, well-known paper, well-liked. He himself was quite the networker. And so he was very active in this anti-union group that that fought strikers during the massive Southwest Railroad strike
Mhm.
in 1886. And so these people, Goodwin included, went around and escorted scabs, confronted strikers. They held meetings in safe houses. And in his interpretation, obviously self-serving, this was a critical factor in smashing that strike. So they start in Sedalia, and then they spread to other small and large communities like Parsons, Kansas, St. Louis. They're in Kansas City. They're all over. And Goodwin is kind of an organizer of these organizations.
Mm.
They were not only interested in breaking strikes and busting unions and blacklisting activists. They also sought to run out labor leaders from communities. They sought to run out socialists. And these run out campaigns, which Klansmen also used, were designed to sort of expel these outside agitators, or what they considered outside agitators. And so we see this happening with the Law and Order Leagues. Fast forward to the turn of the century, J. West Goodwin is leading organizer of the Citizens Alliance movement. This is a artfully named bunch of organizations that were basically employers associations. But by calling yourself a Citizens Alliance, taking attention away from your class and your, hey, who's not a citizen, right? You're drawing attention to, patriotism and civic, good civic duties and whatnot.
Of course.
Yes, and so J. West Goodwin was active in two um, two periods of union busting. Very effective networker, certainly very self-important and violent, and often was on the losing side. He ran his print shop. The workers ended up unionizing, and he reluctantly acknowledged their organization in
Wow.
1907. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So
What
even people like him, uh, could
what's the sort of ideological makeup of a guy like Goodwin in the organizations that I mean, what do we call these things? Are they like right wing fascist organizations? Are they what's their sort of racial attitudes? Like where are these people coming from? Like it seems like I guess I'm sort of thinking like what American political tradition do I place Goodwin in?
Yeah, so he's a Union soldier veteran. He was a veteran. He fought in the Civil War, so you would think, hey, he's this all for the North, anti-slavery and whatnot. But in 1879, he writes a column that I talk about, calling for the reintroduction of the whipping post in Sedalia, because at that time you have all these African Americans fleeing the horrors of the South and settling in places like Kansas and Missouri. And Goodwin writes about these people. He refers to them as criminals. These were folks. Seeking jobs. They come up on the railroads, and he says, you know what? We need to punish these people. They were fine under slavery, and we need to reintroduce one of these, slave management methods, namely the whipping post.
Wow, this guy's just bloodthirsty then,
He's
it seems like.
bloodthirsty.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right. I
yeah,
mean,
no doubt.
I guess that's what's so horrifying about your story is sort of like how does the corporeal like horror of slavery, the kind of like body violence, how does it continue? And it seems like it continues in part like by sort of expanding into these types of organizations and this sort of vigilante streak in even though it might be like a kind of sort of undercurrent in American politics, it also seems like absolutely critical that like there's always the threat that we're going to just beat it out of you,
Yeah.
and that violence is how we make people do things.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, that violent managerial techniques is something that they embraced.
Mm.
I mean, they did it through they were secretive when they did it. They didn't want to draw attention to themselves, and they're not beating workers every day. But during strikes, especially very dramatic ones and minor strikes in Pennsylvania and Colorado and elsewhere. You see employers getting together, kidnapping workers, expelling them, beating
Mm.
them, caging them.
Mm.
You know,
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's this the veneer of civilization that kind of excises the gross violence and says we don't, we have unions now and we have negotiations and we don't fight in the streets, and all of that makes us more civilized. It seems like there's always been a also an undercurrent of, call it conservatism or reactionaries or fascists or whatever, that seem like they really long for the days when we could just use violence to make people do things. You even hear echoes of this on Facebook from conservatives who are like, we used to be able to beat our kids and they were better off for it,
right.
And there's sort of like this longing for control through violence that seems like it's a hallmark of a certain population. Maybe it's in everybody, but it's certainly active and activated by these organizations.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And they obviously they justify it. There's this idea that circulates in employer circles, and that is that there is no such thing as peaceful picketing. There's no such thing as peaceful picketing. So and that they need to, at least at the turn of the century, they need to protect the non-union workers. So we see a shift in the turn of the century where when instead of focusing so much on crushing the dangerous classes, there's this emphasis on protecting the common people, protecting the common people. And so that was a popular phrase articulated by the Citizens Alliance, and of course J. West Goodwin was one of the leaders there. And so in the course of seeking to protect the common people, they ended up crushing union activists in various ways.
How do they get away with that ideologically in terms of defining the common people as like, it's a contradiction that you see today, in terms of like American politics. There's many conservatives, I'm wondering, like, they use that populist language about workers and common people, etc. But I'm like, where are they when 10,000 Amazon workers are being fired, when there are these strikes happening? It seems like conservatives are silent on that, or literally opposed to it. So how do they achieve that in these citizens alliances? That kind of language. How are they kind of making the union people the other? Because there are a lot of strategies for that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, they might look at themselves and say, I used to be a worker and I worked hard, and here I am, leading this business now. And in the context of strikes, I mean, they bring in strike breakers, right? And some of these strike breakers are doing so willingly. Many of them are entering these situations not having known that they were going to cross these terrifying picket lines. Whatever the case, they spin this narrative that they are protecting, that they're not simply looking out for their own bottom line, but they're protecting the interest of these ordinary people. Did they really believe that? I don't know. I can't get into their heads, but that's what they said, right? That's what they said. And from a public relations perspective, it worked. It seems to work pretty good, right? I mean, it's we're protecting the common people. Come and work in an open shop as opposed to a closed shop. Don't be some slave to the union. Right to work, right? I mean, the language.
It seems like that language actually won in American history in the 20th century, particularly in the post-World War II era. The decline of union membership, the decline of people having any language to describe what unions are at all is just sort of gone. And you're right. I guess it is. It's kind of like I mean, there's a lot of similarities with the way that we talk about immigrants and the way that people who are immigrants will talk about other immigrants. There's sort of like, I guess it makes sense within American history that it would be easy to sort of isolate these unions as like fucking everything up for the rest of us. And you can probably do that now easily as well.
Right. No, exactly. And this language is, right to work. It's a little different today than it was then. Today, it pretty much refers to, right to work states or right to work for less states. But in the context of labor unrest, employers and their spokespersons would often talk about giving these non-union workers the right to work. And
Right.
to be fair, unions were pushy. They were aggressive. They had to be, right. I mean, they're blocking the entranceways to workplaces. That's what picket lines did and continue to do, right. And so you could see that tension, and you can see how employers and their spokespersons can capitalize on that, right, in those particular contexts, and then the press will run with it, and that narrative will dominate.
How does this play out in northern Idaho? What is going on in northern Idaho in the last decade of the 19th century? Because it seems like it's a piece of understanding how prisons and incarceration intersect with this story of industrialization.
Right, absolutely. So in northern Idaho, the Coeur d'Alene's region, you have a number of these silver and lead mines, and you have a strong union presence, and you have the employers who organize a mine owners association. There's a lot of confrontation. They lock out, workers protest. And in 1892 and then again in 1899, employers receive help from the federal government and the local government in crushing these protesters. They end up throwing them in what they called bullpens. These were stockyards in the very cramped spaces, often not very good ventilation in these buildings, and they just mass arrested people and threw them in these makeshift jails. And one historian has referred to this as the first use of a concentration camp. I don't know if that's true. There's a discussion about that, but when you look at the scholarship on concentration camps, historians will often talk about the role of the Spaniards in Cuba in that same decade. But the first case of bullpens or concentration camps was in 1892, so that would have been before the Cuban example.
Wow.
And so this is done. The folks who had called the shots were members of these employers associations, that is the Mine Owners Association, and both Benjamin Harrison in 1892 and William McKinley in 1899 sent in troops to reinforce them. Again, mass arrests, beatings, and some deaths as a result of this as well. And so to get out of these bullpens, these workers had, and to get their jobs back, they had to promise that they would not join the union and that they would be a good worker, that they would put America before their class.
So there was no veneer of like, we're charging people with crimes here, or like, because that's a story that Douglas Blackman tells, right? It's kind of criminalization of Black life, a sort of a way of justifying putting people in prison so that you could work them to death would be to sort of like create a system of laws that criminalize things like petty things like gambling, etc. Throw people in prison forever, and then you have a justification. But it seems like what you're describing here in northern Idaho is literally just throw them in the pen because they're organizing.
Right. And it's not, I mean, there are some legal protections here. The in 1893, a judge, the Supreme Court actually weighed in and ruled that this was wrong. Folks were freed at that point.
I was going to say, isn't this a violation of the 14th Amendment at this point?
Right.
I mean, everything we're describing here is, I suppose.
Right. There's the law on the books, and then there's the enforcement of it, and we see very little in the way of enforcement. But what's interesting, though, jails and prisons can work both ways, right? In other words, in 1892 in northern Idaho, many of those in the bullpens used the opportunity of their incarceration to talk with one another and to discuss the importance of building a more militant union. And out of that came the Western Federation of Miners, which emerged in 1893. It wasn't only because of these incarcerated workers, but they were involved in discussions that were later very fruitful discussions that and then we see the formation of this union.
That's amazing. That makes me think of, I mean, in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of talk in sort of like Black liberation circles, Amiri Baraka and a bunch of others who have mentioned that, like, if there's going to be a revolutionary population in America, most likely it's going to come out of a place like prison, because the people there, there are a lot of social and economic conditions that put them in a position of having nothing to lose, and organizing, it seems like a natural piece of the
Right.
prison experience. It seems like a danger almost of
Right.
why, like, they keep people separated and don't let them read. And I mean, all this led to Attica,
Sure. Sure.
and I'm sure you know all of this, but either way, it's fascinating to hear it in the 19th century. This sort of, I'd never heard that before, that there'd be like union organizing happening out of people in prison.
Right, right. The
Yeah, wow.
incarcerated were radicalized as a result of their, as a result of this caging
Of
process.
course, I would be
Yeah,
radicalized if you put me in a
exactly,
cage. Yeah.
exactly. Precisely, precisely.
So, I mean, a lot of this actually makes me think too. You mentioned concentration camps. You mentioned, to me, when I'm thinking about bullpens and barbed wire and putting people in those sorts of scenarios, it resonates with what I know is also going on in the late 19th century in areas like Idaho and beyond. Is Native American wars and Native American genocide.
Sure.
A lot of it involving the state, and a lot of it involving, like, bullpens and this sort of stuff.
Right.
So how does that intersect with this story? Because it seems like it's a bit of in both, I guess, in the Native American story and the story of slavery, you see so much of like the kind of id of whatever the American project is. I know that's kind of a psychological read,
Sure, sure, sure.
I guess literally a Freudian read, but, like, you know what I'm talking about. There's sort of
Yeah.
undercurrent of like deep, dark, genocidal violence
Right.
that's racialized, etc. And it seems like a lot of what the story you're telling is sort of like how those sort of stories of American violence translate into a kind of quotidian violence of capitalism that
Sure.
we know today. And that's why I feel like your book is so important, because it sort of like shows us how it's still there, but in different sort of structures.
Right, right. Well, I appreciate that. And, I do bring up Native American history a bit in one chapter, chapter 4, where I look at this kidnapping in Tampa of cigar workers in 1901. And so this is I think, a really incredible story. I'm certainly not the first one to write about it. Others have, but I don't think many people know about it. And so basically what happened is you have this cigar worker strike led by a radical union called La Resistencia, mostly Cuban, Afro-Cuban, some Italians, very racially mixed group of people. Very militant. There's about 5,000 of them, and they shut down, these cigar factories, the most important product to come out of Tampa in that time. And so one evening, you've got these members of the Citizens Committee, including a guy by the name of D.B. McKay, who they in the evening they go into the homes of 13 of the leaders of this strike. They kidnap them, they put them on a boat, and they bring them to Honduras, and they leave them there.
Wow.
And and then they come back. And so that, I mean, this is
why Honduras? That's just so random.
Yeah, I can't answer that question, but I think it was like an island off of Honduras or something.
Interesting.
Anyway, so they do that, and so the press learns about this, and they say, you know what, this kidnapping, this is a great way to solve the labor problem, right? And other employers do this as well, in Colorado in particular, 2 years later. But going back to the Tampa question, what are the roots of this sort of practice? That is, kidnapping leaders to demoralize or undermine the rank and file. And so I thought a lot about this, and I said, you know what? Many decades earlier, this was the scene of the Second Seminole War against Native Americans. The Seminoles were a lot of Creek Native Americans. There's some escaped slaves, a real mix of people. And the idea that the U.S. government put forward in the context of this war against the Seminoles, which lasted from 1835 to 1842, one of the key strategies that worked for them was to kidnap the leaders of this movement. And so I speculate that the kidnappers in 1901 might have had, it's speculation, it's a theory, might have had this event in mind. What evidence do I use to support that position? Well, D.B. McKay, one of the leaders of the kidnapping campaign in 1901, was an amateur historian. He wrote a lot about the Second Seminole War, and so he loved this history, and he loved the white men who gave civilization to Florida.
Oh
So
God.
I
Yeah.
speculate that there, I try to show these parallels between the 1830s and 40s and the
Wow.
1901. Yeah.
Watch out for the amateur historians.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
exactly.
like makes me think of like a bunch of Proud Boys watching Viking videos on YouTube,
That's
getting
right. That's right.
psyched about torture techniques and axes and all that bullshit.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean
Exactly.
it's it there. I feel like gender and masculinity are in your story as well, in a couple of different ways. And I
Sure.
guess maybe that brings us to the myth making part of this, the narrative elements of this. You talk about this a novelist named Owen Wister.
Mhm.
Who is Owen Wister? And I know he wrote The Virginian, which
Right.
is and I think younger generations might be thinking like, what's The Virginian? Who's Owen Wister?
Right.
But can you describe kind of how important he was as a voice in all of this? Because it seems like it's pretty critical for especially all the like I don't know the gunsmen like
Sure.
the Law and Order shit in the
So
20th century.
so Owen Wister really, more than anybody else, pioneered the Western genre of fiction.
Mm.
Right, the idea
Mm-hmm.
of heroic, individualistic kind of cowboys, and the Wild West and all of that. And so he published this book, The Virginian, in 1902, which was an immediate bestseller. It's since then been adapted into plays and widely read. And so in this book, he talks about this. The main character is the Virginian. He's very deferential to his employer, and the story, in some ways, is based on the Johnson County War. Now, the Johnson County War was in 1892, and it involved the members of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, their vigilante raid into Johnson County against supposed rustlers. They ended up killing a couple folks, and then the people in Johnson County rose up, and the governor, who was also a member of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, collaborating with Benjamin Harrison, sending troops to protect these guys. They were never tried, and so this was a public relations disaster for them. Well, Owen Wister was friends with these guys in Cheyenne, and would hang out at this exclusive club in Cheyenne with members of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. And before he wrote his very famous novel, he talked to some of the members who were involved in this crackdown. And so the novel, in many ways, is an effort to give cover, give legitimacy to individual acts of vigilante violence against, rustlers or those who are lawbreakers. Now, the story is even deeper than that, because Owen Wister, prior to that, wrote very favorably about the National Guard in Pennsylvania and putting down the Homestead uprising. He's of course he's a wealthy Philadelphian. He went to Harvard. He was friendly with good friends with Theodore Roosevelt, and so he's very much aligned with this
You're
this
kind of like,
ruling
how is
class.
this populism? It's
Yeah,
kind of like it's just like these are Harvard guys. It reminds me of George W. Bush hearing some of this stuff. That these are like
exactly.
people that are sort of writing mythologies about the kind of like rugged individual, but they're like
Right,
embedded in the most powerful
right.
institutions in America. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, it goes all the way back to Andrew Jackson, if not before, right? This idea that these, sort of roughneck type privileged people, kind of can identify with ordinary people, right? And so,
Wow. Yeah.
Owen Wister's is, this wealthy Philadelphian. He writes this selling book, and he so in 1907, CW Post, Post Serial. He's a major leader. CW Post was a major leader of the Citizens Industrial Association of America and the National Association of Manufacturers. He's this well-known anti-union figure who's also very wealthy. And the Citizens Industrial Association, really the umbrella group that coordinates a lot of the union busting in the early 20th century, have had a propaganda committee to kind of disseminate, to put together ideas and disseminate ideas to the public. And one of the people on that 7-member propaganda committee was Owen Wister.
Mm.
CW Post chose him. So what a great person to have working for you. This
Right.
guy who published such a famous novel, right, is helping you do PR,
Mm.
right?
Hmm.
Right. And so what Owen Wister will go on and write other novels, including one called Lady Baltimore, which depicts the grievances of these Charlestonian whites after the Civil War, and discusses the way that they are they've been hurt by the emancipation of former slaves,
Mm.
and that this is a real problem. In both books, in both The Virginian and Lady Baltimore, there are parts where the narration talks about not having to wait for the law, and in the to act. In The Virginian, there's, and I call this is the title of my chapter, the law or popular justice. Right.
Right.
If
Right.
the law doesn't work, then popular justice. Well, what is popular justice? Popular justice is the mobilization of employers and cops and National Guardsmen to put down strikers. So
Mm.
they equate popular justice with the interests of the ruling class.
That's a nice trick.
Sure.
And I mean, narratively, I mean, it works, right? It seems like it's something that you hear. I don't know. Like part of it is, I guess the equation with always when you're talking about kind of myth making and these novelists that are doing propaganda for organizations, that there's kind of like this from above thing, but they are also can we talk about like the front, like what, how much of this is from below, how much of this
Right.
this energy is sort of organic or already there, or they're tapping into in some way, if that makes
Right.
sense,
Right.
because
No,
it
it's a good.
seems like there are people who are ready to believe this kind of stuff and
Yeah.
fight for the wrong team in our eyes, but in their eyes I guess they're not.
Right, right, right. No, it's hard to know. So, another thing that these employers and citizens alliances do, they formed anti-union unions.
Mm.
Right? It sounds really odd, but these are organizations of folks who didn't want to be in the union, right? And they're, I guess we could call them company unions, right?
That's
And so this is a way,
amazing.
yeah, yeah. So you have one in the Bunker Hill and Sullivan Company, the mine company up in northern Idaho. You have one in Cheyenne, in Wyoming there, and you have them in a number of northeastern cities as well. Anti-union unions that served as strike-breaking associations in the context of labor unrest.
That, you know what, it makes 100% sense. I mean, when I'm thinking about like just what I know about like Walmart and their anti-union organization,
Sure,
and Amazon too are doing the same thing. The strategies are very, very similar. They sort of like
sure,
appeal to employees and sort of like uh say like we're family. You stay on our team. Our team
exactly.
is and this other team is not the one you want to join, and you want to stay with us. And I don't know. It seems like a language of like that's really common in
Right,
labor organizing. Yeah.
without a doubt. Absolutely, absolutely.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about how you as a historian came to study this stuff. Where did you come from as a scholar and as a human being? What led you to tell these kinds of stories?
It's interesting. I think about this. I guess you could say, I was got interested in labor history sort of early on, and as an undergraduate student, and I found that there was a fair amount written about workers, which I think is great, but not as much about employers. And we know that there's a fair amount of, or at least we know for sure, that labor relations in this country is historically more repressive than the labor history elsewhere. And so I want to know more about the folks, again, who have made the lives of ordinary people kind of miserable. And I want
Mm-hmm.
to name and shame in the process. I find that, a lot of historians writing about this will use, say, the passive voice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Wages were low, conditions were bad, strike breakers were brought in. So the question becomes, well, who are the people behind these actions, right? I wanted to know. And so that led me to really study bosses, broadly defined. And this is I've been doing this a fair amount. This is perhaps my most provocative book, but my first one was on the open shop movement more broadly, and I did a few case studies. And And then, I remain interested in this. Some people say, oh, you're doing a lot of the same stuff, but, labor historians write a lot about workers. I'm a labor historian who's interested in management. There's a lot to study and read about.
Well, yeah, let's talk a little bit about open shop, because isn't that the sort of proto right to work movement, essentially?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yes.
So I always wonder, because I used to work at a Brute College in New York City, which is the business school of the City University of New York. So all the students were like management and accounting students. They all wanted to go into the employer class.
Sure.
But we used to do these as part of a communication program I was part of. I led these debate workshops where the students had to debate issues in business. It'd be like CEO pay, things like that.
Sure.
And one of them was right to work. And so I'd always hear these students try to come up with ideas of how they could sort of argue for and against right to work. And they really, really struggled, because so many of them couldn't imagine why right to work there was anything wrong with it. They thought it sounded like right to work sounded like freedom. It sounded like, well, you should be able to be free to take a job or leave a job whenever you want, and what's wrong with that? And that language was so embedded, in other words, in their education and training around management, that they couldn't conceive of the other side of it. So I wonder, in terms of your book on open shops, like what's the history of that? Because it seems like the other end of it, the kind of collective impulse, isn't really a natural one for Americans anymore, if it ever was.
Right. No, I agree. Open shop, works really well rhetorically, and so there's a rhetorical definition, and then we can talk about it in practice in the context of actual workplaces. So the idea put forward by employers and their spokespersons is that this is a great way to protect the interests of the free worker. That is, somebody who's not a slave to the union, doesn't have to follow union rules, and the manager can hire and fire based on whether or not she or he is loyal, hardworking, efficient, and that kind of thing. So it's easy, I think, to put forward what sounds like a very logical set of comments.
Just sounds fair and equal to people.
Sounds fair and equal, but in practice, what open shop means is, union busting and strike breaking and blacklisting and the mobilization of repressive forces to protect these people. Like anything else, how do you make change? Through individuals or groups, right? It's a very basic thing, right? Mm-hmm. The way you're going to extract benefits from your boss is by uniting, right? Not by begging individually. And like anything else, right? Like anything else. And so what these folks at the top of society feared and continue to fear is a strong, united working class, right? And so they invested a lot of time and energy in the area of public relations, and they succeeded in getting help from some of the best people. I mentioned Owen Worcester. Mm-hmm. Do you know who one of the first people to serve as in the propaganda committee for the Citizens Industrial Association of America was? George Creel. George Creel, who went on to be the propagandist under Woodrow Wilson in World War I. He worked for the Citizens Industrial Association of America before that. He was a newspaper owner and editor in Kansas City.
There's all the propaganda, the sort of always finding ways to employ violence but keep it secret, or find ways
justify
or justify it or write it into the system somehow. It seems like all of it is based on an understanding that in the employer class, management class, elite class, whatever you want to call that, capitalists. I mean, there are bourgeoisie. There are a million different names for it. It seems like that that group of the Illuminati, let's call them that, the eyes wide shut Illuminati. But they seem to understand that, like that they need propaganda, they need violence, they need sort of elements of coercion that even if they have to hide them, they have to rig the system up a little bit, right?
Without a doubt.
And it seems like this is all part of it. The blacklisting stuff is amazing. I mean, I think a lot about the Cold War and like sort of that era in the 40s and 50s of the U.S. government and other organizations and joining with employers to blacklist people, because it's kind of a form of violence. And I know we can stretch the idea of what violence is, but it seems like it's related to what you're talking about in the 19th century in a more brutal way, is achieved through blacklisting, which is just stripping people of the ability to feed themselves and provide for their families, is a form of like state violence that just decimates populations of like professors, actors, screenwriters. I mean, lawyers, all kinds of people are. And of course, unions are probably the ones that still suffer the most from that in the 50s even.
Absolutely. Yeah, I refer to blacklisting as a soft form of repression. And
there you go. Yeah.
Yes, some commentators have even referred to it as the terrors of the blacklist, right?
Yeah.
I think, and what blacklisting did was it punished the individual and also sent a message to others about how not to behave. Right.
Right.
So it's a way of
talk about cancel culture. I mean,
exactly.
It's like, because it puts that. I mean, there's a moment in the Scorsese movie, The Aviator, about Howard Hughes, where he's sort of like threatening this newspaper man not to publish these pictures that he doesn't want published. And he's telling him, he's trying to threaten him and blackmail him and say, essentially like, oh, I'll tell people that you cheat on your wife. I'll tell people. And he's like, you can't blackmail me, just stop. And at some point, Howard Hughes says, well, have you ever been to a communist meeting? And the guy kind of gives up at that moment, because it seems like that's the one thing, that could actually impact his ability to live, is if he's branded a communist. I don't think, I'm not sure if people today that don't study history, I guess, understand how big a deal that was in terms of ruining people's lives. Yeah.
Right. No, absolutely. And the way in which, this history, anti-radical history is tied up in this period in the late 19th and early 20th century as well, right? Where so, the one of the things that these folks really want to do, they weren't just narrative creators, they were narrative suppressors, and they sought to prevent socialists from meeting. They burned books, right? They confiscated leaflets, right? And this is because they didn't, there's certain ideas they didn't want circulate. They want the dominant ideas needed to be the ideas put forward by Owen Worcester and George Creel and the employers they represented.
There's again, coming back to Hollywood history. Sorry, it's the stuff that's in my mind. But there's a group of people like John Wayne and Walt Disney and others created the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals in the late 1940s, and it's almost a blueprint of the type of language you're talking about. They say they say don't smear wealth, and don't smear the entrepreneurial system. And don't make, don't glorify the collective ideas. One of them is great because it says don't glorify the common man. And this is all like advice and that's being given to, filmmakers in Hollywood by very powerful people. And they're saying like, don't do this common man bullshit.
Wow.
It tells you like how much they know, and they're aware of like the power of narrative, or at least they believe in it. Yeah.
Right. No, that's true. Yeah. And I certainly think that you can, see the way in which literature might have served that purpose, right? The way in which all these powerful forces sought to elevate the Virginian and get it circulating, right?
Well, those like dime novels or those popular novels were like the motion pictures of that era.
Right. Absolutely. Well, that's very interesting. That's an interesting parallel.
Wow. Yeah. Your story is so great. And I want to say the name of your book again. Chad Pearson, Capitol's Terrorists, Klansmen, Lawmen, and Employers in the Long 19th Century. Thanks so much for speaking with me. It's really fun.
Thank you. I had a great time. Really honored.
Well, okay, my friends, I think that's going to do it for Nostalgia Trap today. I want to thank my guest, Chad Pearson, for a super fun conversation. Go check out his book, Capitol's Terrorists. Go check out Trap TV. We're giving away t-shirts if you join up between now and December 6th. Thanks so much to all our Nostalgia Trap subscribers and supporters and listeners, etc. We'll talk to you again very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.